I'm so grateful to Father Joe for inviting me to give this presentation tonight for Grace Episcopal Church, and to Aaron Zhu for all your work on the technical aspects of this event tonight. It's really an honor to be here. I need to start off by explaining that I'm talking about my most recent book. Got a little flyer about it that I've handed out. If anyone is zooming in, feel free to email me, and I'll email you the flyer after this event tonight. It's Jones, Jones.2376, Jones.2376 at osu.edu. If you email me and you would like the flyer, I'm happy to send it, but I want to tell you that this is not about trying to persuade you to buy my book. I told even my mother not to buy it because it really is, it's written for other English professors. And that means it's trying to answer questions that have been developed over many years by other English professors, with the result that those questions have grown fairly complex, and answering questions like these is a fairly laborious business. And I could even confess it's necessarily enjoyable to read unless you're already at least a little bit familiar with the conversation. If you're not an English professor, it can feel like jumping into the middle of a legal brief when you're not a lawyer. You wonder why they need quite so many Latin terms when it's supposed to be in English. And you wonder why they keep referring back to other legal cases and decisions and old laws until the footnotes can start to make your head spin. I hope my book isn't quite as dry as legalese, but still, I can't pretend it's fun to read like a John Grisham novel. So, I'm standing up here this evening because I'm of the firm conviction that the big questions I wrestle with in this book are interesting to many people who are interested in storytelling. It's not just English professors. I hope I'm right, and I hope you'll forgive me if I occasionally lapse into the jargon of my profession. I'll try to avoid that as much as possible. But I want to start off with the big question that motivated me to write this book. The question I was trying to set out to answer, because I think this one will make sense to a lot of folks. When reading at least a number of highly influential American authors who've been writing over the past 100 years, and a list of them is on the handout. I'll talk about them shortly. This group just jumps out at me for the ways in which, on the one hand, they critique certain Christian uses of the Bible, especially those uses that have been marshaled to support the oppression of peoples throughout our history, while on the other hand, they surprisingly represent traditional Christian readings of the Bible in their novels as vital to what they're trying to say. Why do they valorize the Christian Bible? Why not just criticize it and move on? What's going on in these novels? To help explain why this is surprising, let me tell you about some of these authors. And I have a little list of the dates of each author so you get a sense of when they were born, or if they passed away, when they died. But I'm going to focus on, in the novels I was looking at, what they're trying to talk about that leads them to criticize Christian uses of the Bible, Christian interpretations of the Bible. So Faulkner is writing about a lot of things, but he's definitely writing about racism in the 19th and early 20th century South. He's also talking about socioeconomic class and gender, and he offers scathing indictments of ignorant and bigoted so-called Christians, especially of the Bible defense of slavery. Not everyone knows that passages from the Bible were often used in the 19th century and beyond to justify slavery. Faulkner explores the ways in which racism warps and challenges white Southerners and their communities. Jumping a little further ahead in the timeline to Toni Morrison, who recently passed away just last year in 2019, she's also exploring racism and the legacy of slavery she's focusing more on the challenge to African American communities. Certainly her novel is, all of her novels, but I'm talking about Beloved here, is for all kinds of readers. But her focus is really on African American characters and communities trying to come to terms with the legacy of slavery. And she too criticizes the Bible defense of slavery, as well as other ways in which the Bible has not helped African Americans. Leslie Marmon Silko, in her famous novel Ceremony, criticizes Christian evangelism for its destructive impacts in the part of the country that's now the American Southwest, especially New Mexico. It's a part of our country that has been a convergence point for multiple cultures that have often clashed: Mexican, Spanish, white American, and indigenous peoples, particularly Laguna and Pueblo. She criticizes the way in which the Christian Bible has been used to denigrate other peoples and cultures. Ana Castillo, in her novel So Far From God, she explores the American Southwest too, a lot like Leslie Marmon Silko, including New Mexico and Arizona, and she criticizes how the Christian Bible has been used to denigrate women, as well as indigenous peoples and cultures. And Monique Trong, a Vietnamese-American writer, in her 2003 novel, The Book of Salt, which for such a new novel has generated a lot of critical interest. It's incredibly just moving and very smart and incredibly ambitious. Her editor apparently told her, do you really think anybody's going to read this? This is some rough going kind of stuff, and it turned out to be a very powerful novel that a lot of people have lauded. She criticizes how the Christian Bible was used to support the colonization of the Vietnamese by the French, and how the Bible has also been used to oppress gay and lesbian people. These criticisms of the Bible are central to the messages conveyed by these novels. It's not a side issue for them. Yet every one of these novels also embraces traditional Christian understandings of the Bible. And what I've done on the handout, and I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll refer to some of it, is I've offered a key Bible quotation for each author and the novel that I was especially focused on here that really sums up what that author seems to see in the Bible that is important, that's valuable. I use the word valorize. That's just basically to say this is really important. So for Faulkner, he often casts Bible-believing Christians as provincial, as ignorant, as even bigoted. But at the same time, he represents the Bible as having a prophetic moral authority, especially in how it points to something deeper or higher than mundane human reasoning about love and the value of human beings. And in this quotation, if you remember the story of King David and his son Absalom, Absalom turns against his father and raises an army, and King David's army rises up to defend the king and crushes the rebellion. And David has asked that they not kill his son, but one zealous soldier ignores that command and kills Absalom. And David's response makes no sense from one perspective, because he has just literally waged a war against his son, and he's the king. But he says, "Would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son." His love for his son overturns all the kind of human hierarchy of who should be king and who's the rebel. It doesn't matter at that point for David. There's something more going on there. This is moving to Faulkner. For Toni Morrison, similarly, in it's really her most famous novel, and she's got a lot of great ones out there, but Beloved, her quotation that she takes from Romans, every other Bible quotation on her handout I've taken from the New Revised Standard Version. This one's from the King James, because that's what she uses in the epigraph to the novel. "I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved." That kind of, again, the reversal of expectations of human ordering and human values that God is somehow reversing. And she used that as a rallying cry and creates a novel that is so deeply challenging. It's hard to make sense of right and wrong there. She's, in a nutshell, trying to say that slavery, the legacy of slavery, racism, is such an evil that utilitarian human conceptions of right and wrong just really can't even approach it. You can't make sense of it that way. And so she brings the Bible into play to help articulate what she's trying to get at, despite that she also criticizes it. For Leslie Norman Silko, I thought this was especially appropriate for a Veterans Day. She wrote this novel in the 1970s, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, hardly really, just barely the aftermath, but she sets it just after World War II and writes about a veteran who's suffering from PTSD. And of course, for its first readers, that parallel was not lost on them. He would have been suffering from what they called shell shock at the time, but PTSD today. She won a McCarthy Genius Award for this novel, by the way. And out of her main character's initial isolation and confusion, he eventually comes to realize that everything is connected and that love underlies it all, even when we can't see it or feel it. And there's a long quotation here at the second, it's the top of the backside of the handout. I'm not going to read it to you, but what's remarkable about it is she takes Laguna and Pueblo beliefs about how the world works and the interconnectedness of all things. And she tells a story about drought and famine on this reservation and ties that to biblical stories of droughts being caused by God, caused by people turning away from God and forgetting their deepest values. And she ties that in turn to the Grail legends, that if you recall King Arthur, they set out because their land is afflicted. Something has gone wrong, and it's manifest in the land itself. There's drought. The Round Table and Camelot have fallen on hard times. And they set out for the Grail in order to heal the land, in order to get back to those deep values. And as Father Joe said in his sermon on Sunday, the Grail is ultimately MacGuffin. It's really about their fellowship, the bonds that they have together. And that's exactly what's true for Leslie Norman Silko as well. For Ana Castillo, she uses Job as her key text. And if you remember the story of Job, terrible, terrible things happen to Job. And he refuses to say that they are justified. He challenges God. Why are these bad things happening to me? And it's the age-old question that we take Job to be the urtext of is, why do bad things happen to good people? But what I love about this text here, and I won't read it to you either, but it's there in case you're interested, is at the end, God kind of rebukes Job and says, who are you to question me? How do you possibly understand? And that's pretty neat to me. I love that. But then God turns around to Job's friends who all along have been trying to say, Job, you shouldn't challenge God, you shouldn't question God. These things are happening for a reason. You must have done something wrong. Maybe your family did something wrong. And in the book of Job, God says, no, you are the ones who are speaking the wrong thing. My servant Job has said what is right, even though he's just rebuked Job. And some people question whether there are multiple texts here put together because it seems to challenge our sense of what makes sense. But to me, that's what I love about the book of Job, and I think what generations of Christians and Jews as well have loved about this story. It challenges us to think differently. And Ana Castillo sees this as, for her, embodying a false faith, embodying Christians who try to justify terrible things that happen to other people. And she wants to criticize that, but she also wants to say there is a deeper faith here. There's something important in this story from the Bible. And for Monique Trong, She uses Paul's image of the body in the first letter to the church at Corinth, famous image of the body that I've printed here, and I won't read that out either, but basically saying, look, you all should get along. The church at Corinth was famously rife with factions and fragmenting, people thinking they were better than other people. And Paul said, think of yourselves as like a human body, where the hand can't say, well, I'm not part of the body because I'm not a foot, and vice versa. The foot can't say that. And if the eye said, well, I'm the most important part of the body, you'd lose most of the rest of what makes us human. And Paul's trying to say, this is what community should be. We can be different and still value each other. It's in a way a reflection on that age-old saying, well, underneath it all, we're all the same. Paul, you could take him to be saying something a little different. We're different underneath it all, but we're connected and we form a greater whole. And that's a deeper truth. So my work in researching this book, Provincializing the Bible, was to try to determine whether there was some connection among these authors, something that would explain this pattern. Is there anything we can learn from recognizing that this pattern is there in a certain strand of American literary history? By way of answering that question, or telling you about the answer I came up with in the book, I want to tell you a story. I think it's one you've heard. In fact, I bet you know it pretty well. You can tell me if you don't. This story dates back at least to 18th century Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and David Hume, and it now goes by the name secularization. And you see, if you got the handout, secularization in American literature. That's a lot of what I think about, a lot of other scholars that I'm responding to. And here's the story. Religious belief is the product of an essentially pre-scientific, superstitious worldview. So the increasingly widespread awareness of the incredible predictive power of scientific methodology and the power of the technologies it produces inevitably leads to the decline of religious belief. Have you heard this one? This is the story of increasing urbanization in America and the decline of mainline churches and clearly the triumph of the secular over the sacred in Western civilization. And for some people this one seems so obviously true that we don't even think about it, but the problem is it's not true. Sociologists and historians over the last few decades have been realizing that the story just doesn't match the evidence. Now, I won't go into too many details, but if you want to ask me about that, I can tell you more about it. But that story that's out there and its failure, the fact that it's not true, is important because that's the key to unlocking the code that ties together the authors I've been talking about. It helps us see why it's significant that they all have a similar love-hate relationship with the Christian Bible. Look back on the handout, this quotation from Depeche Chakrabarty on the first page, and if for those folks online, this is about the title I chose for my book, Provincializing the Bible. It was really inspired by a post-colonial scholar named Depeche Chakrabarty who wrote a book called Provincializing Europe. It was really important to me. And he basically said, look, the European Enlightenment was responsible for all kinds of ills, especially for colonized peoples around the world. And yet, it offers tools to us that we can't dispense with. They're important. And my argument in Provincializing the Bible is that the same thing is true that these authors are saying about the Bible. It has been used in some terrible ways, and yet it has some indispensable tools to offer us. Just to remind folks, I promise I won't go too much longer. I'm watching the clock. The Enlightenment here, when Chakrabarty talks about the Enlightenment, refers to the European intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries. It developed out of the early successes of scientific method, which had developed before that. And we could lump those together into what's often called empiricism. Enlightenment thinkers helped expand scientific empiricism into not just a method, but a metaphysics, an entire philosophy. And that was the change that now seems inevitable, but really wasn't necessarily. The scientific method was a really powerful method, but it didn't have to be necessarily a whole philosophy, a worldview. The Enlightenment thinkers took a powerful method and decided that every question, including non-scientific questions, moral questions, for instance, should use this same method of empirical experimentation. There were some outgrowths of the Enlightenment that were great, but some turned out to have a serious, very serious shadow side. One was the reduction of our ways of knowing to the empirical, which reduced our metaphysics to a naive and reductively mechanistic materialism. And if that sounds like a lot of big words, one of the greatest examples is turning moral questions into questions of scientific method and experimentation based on just available, observable evidence. What happened is that we started to take husbandry methods for breeding animals and apply those to human beings. And the horrific apotheosis of that kind of thinking was Nazi Germany and the idea that we could create a master race and eliminate weaker, impure races. It's madness, and yet it is the trajectory of this kind of thinking. Another shadow side of the Enlightenment was the idea that enlightened Europeans had achieved universal reason, the ability to lift themselves out of their particular moment and their personal perspective and achieve a God's eye view of reality. All other non-European cultures, by this way of thinking, looked primitive, even childlike. That attitude in turn helped justify European colonization because the colonizers could justify their actions by telling themselves they were really doing a favor for the peoples they conquered. They were helping them grow up and out of their superstitious provincial worldviews. In short, this attitude covered over a multitude of sins, as many historians have pointed out about colonization. So what does it mean to provincialize the Christian Bible? That's what I argue these authors are doing, but I want to unpack that a bit, and this goes to my last quotation on the handout by one of my favorite theologians, David Bennett. And basically what he is saying in this quote is the tenor of a lot of his work is to remind us that this Enlightenment idea of universal reason, that we can abstract ourselves out of our actual historical moment, that we should be able to achieve this kind of scientific analysis of everything in life, not just scientific questions, but moral and spiritual ones as well. That really is alien to ancient Christianity and the origins of Christian theology. He says, at the heart of Christian theology is a story. And it's the gospel story that is thoroughly dependent on a sequence of historical events, these are his words, to which the only access is the report and practice of believers. We have these debates in the historical Jesus and what we can learn about Jesus from the Gospels if we discount the evidence of believers. And more theologians and Bible scholars are saying, that's just not a helpful way to approach these doctrines. They are by believers for believers. And he ultimately concludes, David Bentley Hart, that we can't prove faith by a scientific kind of method because it's not that kind of question. And that's okay. He's reminding us that there are other ways of knowing. And the authors I've been talking about this evening are doing something more with the Bible along these lines than simply saying, well, there have been good Christian interpretations of it and bad ones too. There's something deeper here going on. They're saying that if we better understand the roots of oppressions and injustices that we see in our society today, we will learn that the only way to make progress in dealing with those oppressions and injustices is not by moving beyond our past, throwing out all of the traditions that have helped bring us to this moment, despite the Enlightenment and that modern impulse to make it new. That's the slogan of modern art. These authors tell us that we need to embrace ancient truths, that those truths are far from dead, and that in fact our lives depend on these old truths. We can't move forward if we ignore or reject them. We can wrestle with them, as these authors do with the Bible in various ways, but there are blessings to be won from such wrestling, blessings we need. And here I'm alluding to the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Ultimately, these authors challenge a reductive secularization story that would cast religious faith as benighted, superstitious, and hopelessly outdated in our technologically and scientifically advanced society. We need a variety of different ways of knowing in order to understand our world and heal the wounds that divide us. We need scientific ways of knowing, surely, but we also need ancient spiritual ways of knowing too, including, dare I say it, literary ways. But in my book, Provincializing the Bible, I argue that one of the most important things we learn from these authors is to remember that what we often call literary ways of knowing or storytelling were originally biblical ways of knowing, and that we neglect these ways of knowing each other and our world at our peril. Thanks so much for listening to me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to. I'm sorry, it's a lot.
It makes sense, it makes true, but I don't know enough to know what I don't know.
Well, I thank you all for coming out. It's such a treat to get to tell you about this work. It took a lot of years. Heidi did a lot to help me get this book written, and anyway, I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful that it's just come out in a paperback version. Thanks again.
Don't stop.
Daniel's got a question.
Oh, I have a question, I just told me to stop.
Oh, thanks, Dan.
How does this fit into your overall body of published work?
Oh, that's kind of you. Thanks for that question. I started off not focusing so much on religion and the Bible when I was a graduate student, working on my PhD, but it just increasingly became clear to me that a lot of questions just couldn't be answered without really wrestling with Christianity especially, but religion more broadly in American literature and beyond. And my work has sort of morphed over time, but my dissertation really didn't have much of anything about religion in it or Christianity. By the time that became my first book, it was all about religion and Christianity, and that has stuck with me. So I think a lot of my books are about trying to help literary critics see that religious faith is a really important part of literary history, even in contemporary literature. That's a given for medievalists, and Renaissance writers, that literature is a really important part of the culture, but it's often left out of literary critical analysis of 20th century, 21st century authors. So that's what I'm trying.
Would it be fair to say part of what I hear you saying is even when we recognize the ways in which Scripture is being used for evil purposes, even when we need not to lose the reality that it has important ways to teach us about what it means to believe, how we know things, and we need to be careful not to become so concerned with the evil uses that we lose sight of.
That's
reality
exactly
that
right.
teaches us what it means to be whole.
That's exactly right. I mean, so many literary critics will easily pick up on the criticisms of the Bible, and they say, well, that's what this is about, and they'll move on to other parts of these novels that interest them. And one of the things I'm trying to argue is that those are actually the least innovative parts of these novels, because it's fairly obvious, and it's certainly worth saying.
Morrison is clearly not someone who wants to dismiss Scripture as being totally evil.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of critics don't recognize just how profoundly some of these authors have been influenced by the Bible and are trying to use the Bible.
That's interesting. Faulkner is so influenced in spite of everything he says.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Faulkner did not have a whole lot of patience for people he considered ignorant and kind of, bigoted, and he frequently cast Christians in pretty unflattering roles in his novels. And it's funny because in his comments about Christianity outside of his novels, he talks about it in all kinds of different ways. And he uses the word provincial to talk about himself. He said, I grew up with this kind of provincial Christian background. It was just as a part of my life. He sort of says, look, it's one of the ways of thinking about the world, and yet it was with him throughout his entire career as such an important touchstone of what he's trying to say.
Forms in so many ways that can't escape.
Yeah, I think that's true. And at one point he said, I believe I'm a good Christian. I don't know if I am by anybody else's definition, but I think it meant something to him.
Which of these books would you recommend a layperson without a graduate degree in English consider?
Well, that is a very good question. They're all pretty challenging. I think one of the most fun ones is Ana Castillo's So Far From God. It's written, it's been described as a telenovela, as a soap opera, and it's written in a way that you can really just enjoy it, but it's got a lot more going on. I think Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony is really wonderful, but it starts off, it's very challenging because she writes in a way that she wants to capture this veteran's PTSD, and he's very confused, so it's very confusing. But then it clears up if you can slog through it. Monique Trong, that's a tough book. And Absalom is not easy either. Beloved is a little more readable, but it still has some challenging parts. That's a good... partly why I chose these is because they're books that literary critics value tremendously. And I wanted to say, hey, how we're talking about these books, there's another dimension that I think is really important here.
I read Beloved, and I feel better now. I didn't understand all of it. Or one of the other ones she wrote. I'm pretty sure this is it. Long time ago.
It's the most often taught, but she has a lot of other great ones. She was prolific.
Was there one called Babe, or am I mixing that up with something else? I'm pretty sure it's Beloved that I read.
I don't know one called, I don't think there's a Babe.
Yeah, it's Beloved then.
Sula and The Bluest Eye, and there's some others that are taught often, but Beloved is the most famous.
Yeah, it's hard to read.
Can you say again what you said about the book, because I wasn't writing fast enough? Like, the categories of good and evil were not humanly capable of addressing them without the scripture or something.
Yeah, what these authors all seem to share is they turn to the Bible as a way of talking about social justice and evils in our world and love, because they seem to feel the need to articulate those things beyond kind of mundane, human, say legal or scientific, or utilitarianism is one of the ways of talking about right and wrong that I think makes sense to a certain mathematical mind, but is rejected by a lot of authors. And one of the things I do, the book is larger and gets into all different kinds of histories, but authors throughout the 19th century often drew on the Bible in this way. So Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian author, was a devout Christian and hated utilitarianism. And it was very current in his day, and he, you could argue that some of his novels were really written against it, and he thought, like, you just can't weigh people in the balance that way. Set out a neat calculation for the morality of a certain situation and what do you do in this kind of situation. But even somebody like Percy Shelley, the earlier 19th century British poet who declared himself an atheist, that meant a little something different then than it does now, but he would not just consider himself a Christian by any stretch. He used the Bible to criticize what basically would become utilitarian kind of calculations of right and wrong. He used the term the calculating faculty. And it was just fascinating to me to once I saw this pattern, to see so many authors drawing on the Bible to say there's something deeper. I've described it one way in an earlier book I did on the Bible and literature, because I think this is so powerful for literary authors, that you see again and again, if you look at the Bible as a story about God, right? There are all different kinds of ways to look at it, but you could see God as the main character, trying to woo the Israelites, the people of God, to love him. And there are different portrayals, as you well know, in the Bible of how that works. If you love God, good things will happen to you. But I think the story of Job is not alone in saying that God wants us to love him in a way that's deeper than just loving him to get something good out of the bargain. You remember the story of Job starts off with God and Satan arguing about Job, and God says, look at my servant Job, there's none like him. I mean, he's so great. And Satan says, oh, that's because he has it good. Let me take away some of those good things and he will curse you. And God says, no, I don't think he will. And God ends up being vindicated in the end, of course. But I think you see this in many ways, especially in the Gospels, that the Bible seems to suggest love is deeper than just a reward-punishment system. There's something deeper there that God is drawing us toward, and that has resonated with so many authors, I think.
Well, is part of what you're saying that literature can understand the Bible and has, in a native way, sometimes more than we can without? Because literature's got a story. The story of the Bible has always been powerful for writers.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. I would probably phrase it from the other direction, that our sense of what literature is has really grown out of the Bible. You go back and I started off when I was in graduate school studying the 18th century, and you think about what students of 18th century British literature are studying, and I used to think, well, those were the big popular texts of the time, Gulliver's Travels, for instance, or Clarissa, the big, huge epistolary novel by Samuel Richardson. But in fact, they were reading sermons. Those novels were important. For sure, they were huge in their day, but far more popular were sermons. And at that time, literature was not considered a high art. Some epic poems were, but certainly not novels. And other people before me have argued that our sense of the novel as a valuable art form has grown out of its increasing association in the 18th and especially into the 19th century, its association with the Bible. So I think we've forgotten that often, and then we look back and we can say, okay, literature can help us understand the Bible, because thinking in literary ways is often what the Bible is doing, but if you want to take it from the other perspective, it's really the Bible in some ways taught us to think that way. Now, I wouldn't say the Bible is the origin text of everything, so I don't want to paint that kind of picture. There have been beautiful stories that work in very metaphorical ways, that literary kind of quality in many other traditions. But I think for American literature, the Bible is a key text there. Well, thank you all so much.
I find it interesting to have almost so many different cultures represented in the authors you quoted, which gives us almost universalism of how we misuse Scripture against almost every culture or expression, and yet all of them seek at something deeper within it, which is so it's kind of universalism of Scripture in every way.
Yeah, these are very different authors, and I'm not sure more than one of them would identify themselves as a Christian. I don't know what Toni Morrison might have said, but Faulkner's the only one who I know who made a statement about it. And I know, Leslie Norman Silko gets really mad at Christians in some, she's said as much in other writings, and yet she's drawn here, and they're all talking about kind of different problems, and it was just striking to me. I've been reading and teaching these authors for years, and before I sort of saw this pattern and thought, there's something there I got to talk about. And it wasn't that I set out to create a coalition of very different authors. It's these people who are very widely respected by literary critics. They're doing really interesting things with the Bible that people aren't writing about much. And it did, I think, happenstance kind of illustrate this really powerful, that voice of the Bible for such different authors. I mean, even the two who write about the Southwest, they're coming at it from very different angles. And anyway, thanks for that. That's an astute observation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all again for coming out, and I really appreciate your interest.